What if intelligence isn't a blessing, but a beautifully disguised burden? We live in a world that glorifies intellect, insight, achievement. From a young age, we're told that being smart is the key to success, to freedom, to happiness. But what if the very thing we chase, this sharp, analytical mind, is also the reason we can't find peace? The more we understand, the more illusions we're forced to abandon. Success begins to feel hollow. Love reveals its conditions. Even purpose starts to seem like a trick we play on ourselves. To give meaning to something that's slowly slipping through our hands. This ... is the paradox of intelligence. It brings clarity. But clarity often strips life of its comfort. And that's exactly what the philosopher Arthur Schopenhauer understood. Long before modern psychology gave it a name, he believed that intelligence doesn't always lead to joy. In fact, the more you see, the more you feel. And the more you feel, in a world full of chaos and impermanence, the more you suffer. Today, we call it overthinking, burnout, analysis paralysis. But Schopenhauer called it what it truly is, a restless intellect, turned inward on a world it cannot fix. So here's the question. What if intelligence doesn't save you, but slowly strips away everything that once made life feel simple? But what if one philosopher saw intelligence not as salvation, but as exposure? Part 1. Schopenhauer's Cold Mirror. To understand why intelligence can feel like a curse, we must look into the mind of the man who saw it most clearly. Arthur Schopenhauer. Born in 1788, Schopenhauer lived in a world already unraveling, riddled with war, political upheaval, and a growing disillusionment with the ideals of reason and progress. But unlike his contemporaries, who wrote of freedom, progress, and human perfectibility, Schopenhauer turned his gaze inward and downward. He didn't seek to inspire hope. He didn't sugarcoat reality. Instead, he described life as it is, restless, driven by blind desire, and ultimately defined by suffering. To Schopenhauer, intelligence wasn't a virtue to be celebrated. It was a mirror, and not a warm, forgiving one. A cold mirror, one that reflects back the world as it truly is, without illusion, without comfort, without mercy. The more intelligent you are, the clearer you see through the social scripts, the false promises of happiness, of meaning, of control. You begin to recognize the futility of endless striving, the hollowness of material success, the impermanence of love, beauty, even joy. Where others find comfort in distraction, the intelligent mind breaks through the facade. It sees the fragile scaffolding holding up our emotional lives and realizes how easily it could all collapse. And in that moment of clarity, something inside begins to shift, not toward triumph, but toward detachment. Schopenhauer believed this was the destiny of the awakened mind. Not joy, not victory, but solitude. Because once you begin to understand the machinery of life, the cycles of desire, disappointment, decay, you can no longer pretend. You can no longer return to ignorance. And that's where his philosophy laid the foundation for a generation of existentialists who would come after him. Kierkegaard, the Christian existentialist, spoke of despair not as a mental illness, but as a sign of spiritual awakening. Camus, writing during a century of war, called life absurd, but urged us to revolt by finding meaning in the face of meaninglessness. Sartre declared that existence itself comes before essence. and that freedom, when faced directly, is terrifying. But Schopenhauer saw it first. He saw that intelligence heightens awareness, and awareness exposes the void. It doesn't give you control over life. It gives you sight. And that sight often reveals what most people are not yet ready to see. So the question becomes, once you've seen reality without its mask, how do you live among those still dreaming? Part 2. Seeing through the illusion. To be intelligent is not just to know more, but to see through more. And often, what you see is what others spend their entire lives trying not to. We're born into a world of fictions, where success equals happiness, and love pretends to be unconditional. That we're moving towards something meaningful, if we just try hard enough. But for those with heightened awareness, these promises begin to unravel. You start to notice how shallow certain achievements feel once they're reached. You realize that the joy of victory fades almost as quickly as it arrives. You see how most of what people chase, money, attention, titles, are not ends in themselves, but distractions. A highly intelligent person doesn't just understand these patterns. They feel them viscerally, and that feeling is often not one of enlightenment, but of alienation. Because while others are content to believe, you've seen behind the curtain. You've seen that pleasure is temporary, that desire is endless, that even happiness, so often idealized, is conditional dash, dependent on circumstances that constantly shift. This is why Schopenhauer believed that intelligence increases not just clarity, but suffering. Because when you strip away the lies, you're often left with something no one wants to talk about: the void. The quiet, aching sense that nothing is as permanent or as meaningful as we hoped. And in today's world, this feeling has a name: existential anxiety. It's the experience of having everything and still feeling nothing, of achieving what others dream of, but wondering why it doesn't feel like enough, of scrolling endlessly, consuming knowledge, success stories, wisdom, and still asking, what's the point? This kind of anxiety doesn't stem from failure. It stems from awareness, the awareness that life has no inherent structure. And that meaning, if it exists at all, must be built from the inside out. It's the weight of being awake in a world that's mostly asleep. And here lies the quiet tragedy of intelligence. It gives you eyes to see the truth, but often takes away your ability to enjoy the illusion. Meanwhile, the less reflective, the so-called simpler minds, seem to live more easily. They're not burdened by the need to explain everything. They're not paralyzed by infinite analysis. They can find joy in the small, in the immediate, without needing it to mean something cosmic. It's not that they're foolish, it's that they're free, in ways the intelligent rarely are. And so, as intelligence peels back layer after layer of illusion, you're left with a mind that sees too much, and a heart that struggles to stay open. But where does this all come from? Why do we desire so much, chase so endlessly, and then collapse when it means nothing? To understand this disillusionment, we need to explore the engine behind all human restlessness, the will. Part 3. The will to live, beauty and cruelty. To understand why intelligence so often leads not to peace, but to inner turmoil, we must look at the invisible force that Schopenhauer believed governed all life. A force he called the will to live. This will is not conscious. It's not thoughtful or kind or strategic. It is blind, relentless, a primal impulse that pushes all living beings to survive, to reproduce, to chase, to crave. It doesn't care about meaning. It doesn't care about happiness. Its only purpose is to continue. Schopenhauer saw the will not as something noble, but as a tyrant. One that disguises itself through our desires, dreams, ambitions, and emotions. We think we want to be successful, admired, loved. But in truth, these are just costumes the will wears to keep us moving. Most people are unaware of this. They live by the will without ever seeing it. They chase one goal after another. New relationships, new careers, new experiences, always believing that the next achievement will bring fulfillment. But it never does. Because the will doesn't rest. It doesn't allow satisfaction. It replaces one longing with the next. But what happens when you become aware of this mechanism? This is where intelligence becomes a double-edged sword. The more perceptive you are, the more you start to notice the pattern. How every fulfilled desire quickly collapses into emptiness. How every success creates new expectations. How every pleasure is followed, inevitably, by loss. And you begin to ask, what am I really chasing? Here's where the disillusionment begins. Because once you recognize the will, you can no longer believe in the things that once kept you going. You no longer trust the next goal to satisfy you. You no longer find comfort in desire itself. And when the will loses its mask, you lose your place in the world. Schopenhauer believed this confrontation was unavoidable for the intelligent mind. The more clearly you see the will, the more alienated you become from those who still live within it. You're no longer swept up in collective ambition. You become an observer, watching others chase what you know won't last. And that distance is isolating. Let's take a real-world example. Imagine a man who has it all. Wealth, status, recognition. From the outside, his life looks enviable. He's achieved what so many dream of. But inside, there's a growing emptiness. He wakes up, not with joy, but with dread. The excitement of success has faded, and nothing new excites him anymore. He begins to see through the script he's been following. The script society wrote, and the will performed. And still, he wonders, how can winning feel so much like losing? Why does everything feel meaningless now? This isn't depression. This is awareness. This is the will exposed. Schopenhauer argued that intelligence often brings us to this point, a kind of spiritual exhaustion. You see that your entire life was built around craving. But now that craving feels hollow, you can't go back. But you don't know where else to go. And here lies the paradox. Because while the will has created so much suffering, we also owe it our survival. It's the fire that drives all evolution, but it burns us from within. The intelligent suffer more not because they're weaker, but because they see more. And what they see is the machinery of existence itself. Desire devours itself, like fire feasting on fire, until even the ash aches to burn again. But Schopenhauer didn't leave us in despair. Even in the chaos of the will, he saw a place of stillness, a temporary liberation from the fire. Article, Part 4, Art as Escape or Awakening. In a world driven by blind, restless craving, Schopenhauer saw one sacred refuge, one place where the will grows quiet. That place is art. To Schopenhauer, art was not entertainment. It was liberation. For a brief, sacred moment, art lifts us out of the machinery of desire. It silences the endless question, what's next? It removes the burden of striving, achieving, becoming, and it returns us to a state of pure perception, where we are no longer grasping, but simply witnessing. This was not philosophical poetry for Schopenhauer. It was his core prescription for the suffering mind. When you gaze into a painting, when you lose yourself in a piece of music, when you are moved by a story beyond words, you stop wanting, and for that moment, you are free. Art, he believed, suspends the will. It interrupts the craving. And in that space, we breathe. Among all the forms of art, Schopenhauer held music in the highest regard. Unlike painting, which depicts forms, or literature, which imitates life, music is pure form, pure feeling. It doesn't describe the world. It expresses something deeper, something primal, something that is the world. He called music a direct manifestation of the will, but not in the sense that it traps us. Instead, it reveals the will's structure, without making us feel enslaved by it. If you've ever felt your heart pulled by a melody, or your breath slow while watching a silent snowfall, you've tasted what he meant. This, to Schopenhauer, was the only time human beings step outside the cycle of craving. Not because they escape life, but because they see it clearly. But the power of art isn't locked in galleries and concert halls. It lives all around you. And here's where the philosophy becomes practical. A single moment of presence. Watching steam rise from a morning cup of tea, feeling wind brush your skin, noticing the way a shadow curves across a room, can have the same effect as a symphony if you truly see it. This is where his ideas align beautifully with mindfulness. The invitation is not to escape, but to become radically present. To observe without hunger, to listen without commentary, to be without becoming. When you approach the world in this way, not as something to use, but something to witness, you begin to discover a quieter kind of beauty, one that doesn't depend on possession or status or recognition. The Japanese call it wabi-sabi, the appreciation of imperfect, impermanent things, a crack in a cup, the fading light of dusk, the silence between words. Schopenhauer would have understood this completely, because in those tiny passing moments, we are free from the will. We are not striving. We are simply here. Art reminds us that life is not only a struggle, it's also a composition. One we don't always need to fix, but simply feel. And when we allow ourselves to feel without needing, we awaken. Not by escaping the world, but by seeing it without wanting to change it. The question now is, can we live this way? Not just in rare moments, but as a mindset. So how do we bring this transcendence into daily life? Not just in fragments, but in rhythm? Part 5. Quieting the will. After laying bare the structure of suffering, its roots in endless craving, Schopenhauer offered a solution so radical, most couldn't accept it. He didn't suggest we chase better desires. He didn't recommend we control the will. He suggested something far deeper. We must quiet it, not destroy it, not escape it, but soften its grip through awareness, detachment, and profound acceptance. To Schopenhauer, true peace isn't found in victory over the world, but in releasing the inner engine that drives us to need anything from it. In other words, freedom comes not from satisfying the will, but from stepping outside its commands. This perspective aligns surprisingly well with ancient Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism, which Schopenhauer studied and deeply admired. Buddhism teaches that suffering comes from attachment, and that liberation comes not from fixing the world, but from understanding its impermanence and letting go. The Buddha spoke of dukkha, the suffering baked into existence. and proposed a path of awakening through mindfulness, simplicity, and release. Schopenhauer's path mirrors this, but rather than following religious ritual, he proposed a philosophical practice of quieting the will through self-observation and intentional detachment. So how does this look in real life? It begins with watching your desires, not judging them, not acting on them immediately, just observing. You feel a craving rise, a need to check your phone, prove a point, buy something, win approval. Instead of reacting, you pause. You ask, what's beneath this impulse? Often, you'll find fear, loneliness, insecurity, the will cloaking itself in something urgent. By noticing without fusing to the urge, you create space. And in that space, the will loses its urgency. The next step is learning to disidentify with your thoughts. Just because your mind says something doesn't mean it's true or worth following. Thoughts are weather. They come and go, but most of us live inside the storm. We let the narrative run unchecked and wonder why we feel so exhausted. Practices like meditation are not just spiritual fluff. They are disciplines of liberation. Sitting in silence, watching the mind move, you begin to see the will in real time. And you learn how to let it pass without getting caught. This isn't about indifference, it's about clarity. You begin to choose where to invest your energy, not based on impulse, but on what nurtures your inner stillness. And then there's simplicity. Schopenhauer wasn't advocating for asceticism, but he understood the wisdom of having less, of doing less, of letting go of the illusion that more will ever be enough. A walk in nature, a single meaningful conversation, an afternoon without goals. These are not escapes. They're acts of quiet rebellion against the tyranny of the will. To quiet the will is to move through life with less noise and more depth. It's not about becoming passive, but about becoming free. Because when you stop reacting, you start responding. And that response is rooted not in fear, but in awareness. And that's where the paradox unfolds. Maybe intelligence was never the problem. Maybe it's the potential we misused. Part 6. The gift within the burden. If intelligence can expose illusions, if it can unravel false hopes, break down empty desires, and show us the harsh truth of the will, then what is it really for? Is it just a sharper weapon to dissect life? Or could it be something more? Schopenhauer believed that intelligence, when left unchecked, leads to suffering. But when cultivated with awareness, with humility, and with detachment, it becomes something entirely different. It becomes wisdom. The true gift of intelligence isn't the ability to control more, it's the ability to see clearly and let go when the moment calls for it. Because insight without surrender becomes anxiety. Perception without compassion becomes judgment. We all know this version of intelligence. The critic, the perfectionist, the cynic. Sharp, brilliant, but cold. Cut off from others, and often from themselves. But there is another path. The intelligent person can choose to use their insight not to dominate, but to understand, not to deconstruct others, but to forgive them. And that's the highest form of intelligence, awareness, tempered by mercy. Because once you see that everyone is driven by the same restless will, the same hunger, the same confusion, you begin to soften. You let go of the urge to take things personally. You no longer argue to win, but to understand. Your mind no longer sharpens blades. it begins building bridges. This is where compassion enters, not as sentimentality, but as deep recognition, an understanding that we are all caught in the same storm, even if we're steering different ships. Tritu thatsu, nu Schopenhauer ngamnoi, kong tach biet kon ngoi koi tegioi. Majua ho jengan hun voitat kan hungai janko jau trongim lang. And when intelligence meets compassion, something powerful happens. You stop seeing others as threats, as competitors, as flawed systems to be analyzed. And instead, you see them as mirrors, as travelers, as beings, just like you, trying to make sense of the noise. In this way, the curse becomes a calling, the burden becomes a doorway, and the intellect, once heavy with isolation, becomes light with purpose. Because when you understand suffering, you understand people. And when you understand people, you no longer need to stand above them. You want to walk with them. That's the choice intelligence gives you. To isolate, or to include, to critique, or to connect. And perhaps the deepest wisdom of all is knowing when to stop thinking and start listening. Because sometimes the most intelligent thing you can do is to put down the questions and simply be present. Not to fix life, but to feel it. Not to escape the world, but to hold it with open hands. So now, as we close this journey, don't just reflect, choose. Will your intelligence keep you trapped in thought? Or will it finally become the light that helps you feel life as it is? Create meaning, don't chase it. If this message touched something in you, if you felt the weight of overthinking or the loneliness of seeing too clearly, then maybe it's time to pause. Schopenhauer didn't offer comfort, he offered clarity. And clarity, when met with compassion, becomes transformation. So I ask you, has your intelligence brought you closer to peace or further from it? Share your thoughts below. Let your reflection help someone else feel less alone. And if you're still here, type this in the comments. I don't search for meaning. I carve it into time by the way I live. Because that's the shift, from chasing to choosing, from knowing to being. Thank you for being part of this space. Until next time, stay aware, stay grounded, and stay human.